garden club members joining us. So I'm going to ask them if I miss something or they have something to interject, to please don't hesitate to interject or put it in the chat, because there's so much information that we have, and we all have different perspectives too of things. But just like she said, what I wrote this book for the 100th anniversary of the Elgin Garden Club. During that year, our club wanted to give back to the community. We've always been a service organization and a gardening, but also giving back to our community. So that in 2006, besides the book, we also put a sculpture out at Raycow Branch of the library. You may have seen. We planted an oak tree at the main library. And then our big event was we provided a free event at the library for the public to come and hear speakers from Kew Gardens in London. And if anybody has ever been there, it's a phenomenal place. And he kind of brought it to life for us and shared information about it. So that was a wonderful, wonderful program. So, so I wrote this book intending it to be a history of our garden club. But as you know, you start researching things, and it gets more and more interesting. And it came to my mind that the history of the garden club is also sort of the history of Elgin from a woman's perspective. So I'm going to share the screen and I've got a little PowerPoint here. And where do I put, is it?
I think it's ready to go.
It's ready to go? Mm-hmm. Okay. So this is our logo for our club. Okay. How do I go to the next slide?
No,
it's not working.
Stop the share for a minute. Oh, there it goes. Okay, it's just thinking.
Okay, it's just thinking about stuff.
So
okay.
There we go.
So,
yeah.
Okay. So if we go back to 1916, when our club started, there was a national movement about taking care of our land and appreciating nature. Our first federal national parks were founded in 1890. The National Park System was established in 1916. Besides that, people were like John Muir had started the conservation movement. There was a growing awareness, which I think we've kind of forgotten the last few years, but there was a growing awareness of the destruction of explosive growth. And that conversation comes up even now with all the growth that we see in our suburbs, even Elgin. Between 1874 and 1878, over 300 sportsmen's organizations started, like Max McGraw. I don't think it's that old, but and then in 1891, the first garden club in the nation was founded in Athens, Georgia. So 1898, the Lord family donated 108 acres of land and to create a park in Elgin for workers that lived in apartments and small houses. They could get out on the weekends and go enjoy nature. So the Lord family donated that. And then the Wing family donated in 1903, they donated 121 acres, which now is our beautiful Wing Park with the oldest 9-hole golf course, municipally owned golf course in the state. So in 1916, a lot of garden clubs started throughout the nation. There were several clubs in the country in Illinois. Women had been voted the right to vote in 1913 in Illinois before a lot of other states. And the Industrial Revolution had given women a lot of freedom. They had more conveniences at home, so they didn't have to slave at home all the time. They could get out and enjoy things like gardening and whatnot. So when we were starting our club, we got a lot of help from Mrs. Brewster, Mrs. Walter Brewster. Everybody went by their husband's first name, right? She represented the garden clubs of Illinois, and she was from Lake Forest, and she gave us a lot of advice on how to start our club. So our club sent out letters to a lot of existing clubs. The three main people that started the club were Rose Eaton, Mrs. Alfred Edwards, and Mrs. Brewster Hornbeak. And I read all the minutes from our garden club meetings, and it became so interesting. But you see the same names, over and over throughout the years, and you kind of got to know them really well. as they changed through the years. But these women sent letters out to a lot of different garden clubs to get advice on constitutions and rules and meeting procedures and so forth. Our annual dues for the first year were $1. The officers and the members that started this club were kind of a who's who of 1916 Elgin. A lot of the families that started our club continued with future daughters-in-law and daughters and nieces, and continued their family membership in the club. And we've had several that have several generations now that have been with us. One example is Sarah Hudgens, who many of you probably know Sarah. She's a third-generation member. Her grandmother, Mrs. Bruce Kirkpatrick, was a charter member, and then her mother, Marion, who we called Gip Kirkpatrick, was very, very active in our club for many years. Some of the homes are still standing, some are gone, that our members lived in. They kind of lived on the main, Elgin wasn't nearly as big as it is now, but they lived on the main roads that had, main streets that had some of the beautiful mansions in Elgin, because most of these people, their husbands were very successful business people. And they had some beautiful fine homes and fine gardens. So these are just a few, and there's a lot I wish we could have gotten pictures of, but the museum helped us as much as they could to try to find some of those homes. So not long after the club was founded, World War I came along, and the war broke out. And so there was a much more awareness. People started talking about growing their own vegetables and providing food to people that, so we could free up food to send to the troops. So they started the Victory Garden idea, and they were urging people to do that. So in the 20s, after World War I, many people started traveling to Europe. So after the war, a lot of the soldiers came back and started talking about the gorgeous gardens and castles and all these things they saw in Europe. And it got people curious. And a lot of the more well-to-do people started traveling to Europe and seeing all the gorgeous gardens and whatnot. And so they started bringing flowers back here and introducing what we consider ordinary flowers maybe now, but back then they were really special. So all these women were starting to add these things and take an interest in making their own gardens beautiful. So they brought in phlox and peonies, and then iris, which the iris, we had a vote in our club of what our club flower was going to be. And the iris won hands down, and it is still our logo today, is the iris. So during the 20s, the club did a lot of touring one another's gardens. Maybe that was one-upmanship, I don't know. But they enjoyed meeting at each other's homes and touring their gardens and having refreshments. And they'd hear from, then they also had talks from some of the members who did go to Europe. Mrs. Watts presented a program on her trip to Cuba. Mrs. Dunham, who we've heard that name, she had a trip to Italy that she shared with the group. Mrs. Hunter went to England and Kew Gardens, which that was one of the reasons we had Kew Garden again at our 100th. And Mrs. Bothworth had gone to Japan. And a lot of flowers we have now are originated from Japan. So, and then our club took trips to view other beautiful gardens. This one was one, they went to the Shakespeare Gardens in Evanston, which was a real outing to drive all the way to Evanston on, little 2-lane roads. And they all met at the Congregational Church and piled into cars and took a road trip over to Evanston to see the Shakespeare Gardens. They also had flower shows in the 20s. More and more garden clubs existed then. Almost every town had at least one garden club. And so they would get together for flower shows and competitions, flower arranging, and even single flowers, showing, they'd have different categories, peonies or roses, and they'd be given awards for different things, best arrangements, And one that I found interesting because I never understood what these, I guess they must have been very popular in the 20s. Wall pockets. Do any of you know what wall pockets? They're like ceramic flower holders you put on the wall, and then you could put some flowers in them. Well, they would even have competitions for that. So, and then our garden club was pretty well known in Illinois, or at least in the Chicago area. Our garden club was asked by the Chicago Tribune to serve as the judges for the Chicago Tribune Garden Contest. So we had Mrs. Kalish and Mrs. Kirkpatrick. They had to visit 41 gardens throughout the area to judge. And of course, guess what? One of ours won. One of the Elgin Garden Clubs actually won. Wonder why that was. No. In the early 20s, our garden club was already established as a leader, as I said, in the Chicago area. We became a charter member of the Garden Clubs of Illinois in 1927. There were 28 clubs that started, and within 2 years, it had grown to 79 clubs. So there were a lot of clubs that started up in Illinois. Our own member, Mrs. Callender, was the vice president of the state organization. We weren't all just about fancy garden parties and touring each other's gardens. Some of our members really got into horticulture, and um, we had people that would advocate for forest preserves and things like that. Mrs. Callender was a delegate to the Women's National Farm and Garden Association in the 20s. She went to Washington, D.C., and she advocated at a state level to support projects of other states or other towns, like Rockford wanted to have the Pines of Ogle County designated a safe, not to get built on. We were advocates for the forest preserves movement in Kane County. And we also advocated for a national flower, which became the rose. Some of the good works that our club did in the 1920s, the very first project they did was to beautify our train stations. And kind of to back up, one of the reasons they did all these projects, women at that time, their husbands were all the business owners and successful, owned factories and successful businesses. But the women started seeing that as our town became more and more established and we had a lot of prosperity in town, we also needed to provide beauty and beautiful spaces for people to enjoy. The town had to look good. It was also a quality of life issue. So their very first project was to beautify our train stations, and they also distributed garbage cans all over town because people were we think that's a 1950s and 60s thing. No, that was happening back then too. People were throwing their trash all over the place. So they decided one way to help beautify the town was to have plenty of garbage cans. And then Oakcrest in 1922, our club raised the money and got donations to beautify the front of Oakcrest, which is still there on Route 31. We've always had a close association with Oakcrest. And Mrs. Hill from Platte Hill today, Mrs. Hill was a member, and her husband helped, and probably at a discount, provided a lot of the roses and evergreens to plant there. So there's a lot of community, history to all these projects. And then Larkin Center, we provided trees and shrubs, and in many cases, our members did the digging and the planting. And then we got involved with the YWCA, Camp Twendowee. We did landscaping out there in 1929. We also beautified the entrance to the country club, which many of our members belonged to the country club at the time. So everything kind of changed in 1929, and things drastically changed for the world and our club as well. And we adapted and we did what we needed to do. So we went from fancy garden parties to doing charity work. We still had garden shows, but we raised money for charities when we had garden shows. Our mission was a little bit different. We contributed to war efforts by collecting materials. We sent flowers and food and other supplies to hospitals and orphanages. primarily in Chicago, but also in our own area. As you know, up to that point, Elgin was a pretty prosperous town and didn't have the dire needs that Chicago did, but that was changing also. We had people in our own community that needed help. Our club would have work days and get together and sew and make things to send to hospitals, bed sheets and things like that. And they continued meetings and social gatherings, and they would play bridge at the Union League downtown. All of our meetings from the 30s and 40s, all of our meeting minutes are missing, and we don't know exactly how often they met or any of the details from the 30s and 40s, but I was able to go to the library and get a lot of the old newspaper articles. We would announce all of our meetings would be posted in the paper every week or two. One of the things that we did to raise money for our community was the spring markets. And by this time, you know, there were other garden clubs in town also, and we all participated in these things. We would host a spring market day at the YMCA every year, and we'd sell, and we'd have committees for each of these things. There'd be a committee for annuals, and they would sell annual flowers. And we'd have another committee that would get perennials together, and we would sell perennials and rock garden plants. And then they'd also have some foods, jams and jellies, and gardening supplies like garden gloves. And then one of the big draws was to have a judged flower show that was open to the public. You didn't have to be a garden club member. Anybody could come, kind of like the county fair, and you could enter your flowers and be judged. And so all the money that we made from these events would go to help our community. In later years, this event was held at Mrs. Kirkpatrick's home, which was, I mentioned earlier that her mother was a charter member. And then back to, you know, just like in World War I, they were encouraging people to have home gardens and grow their own food and give extra food away to food pantries and whatnot. There was a lot of rationing to supply our troops with food and supplies. There was a push to gather scraps for recycling, and our garden club members participated in all of that. We gave money to Associated Charities, Elgin Health Center, Family Welfare Association. Some of our members were on the boards of these organizations, and we held ice cream socials to raise money for the Elgin Health Center. Many of our members were very active in a lot of these agencies. In 1935, there were 1,450 relief gardens in Kane County. And you think about, we were not nearly as populated in 1935 as we are today. That was a lot of gardens, 1,450. And people would work plots, and then they would give the extra to back to the community to share. So as I said, we helped collect paper and metal and anything we could to help with the cause. Our club, along with other garden clubs throughout the Chicago area, belonged to an organization called the Plant, Flower, and Fruit Guild. And what the plant, and my tongue gets tied every time I try to say this, the Plant, Flower, and Fruit Guild collectively did work to help the needy. And so every week each club would collect fresh flowers from people's gardens, whatever was in season. Peonies were the big one, and send armloads of these by train. And we'd have a specific train that we would have to take our flowers to each week. And the train would take them into Chicago. And then in Chicago, and this picture is from the flower booth in Chicago. From there, they would distribute them to hospitals and nursing homes and veterans hospitals to just help cheer people up for what they were going through. And we also sent jellies and things like that in. So our own Mrs. Knight, who was one of our key members, she became the president of the Plant, Flower, and Fruit Guild in 1948. And then in later years, we continued in the Plant, Flower, and Fruit Guild. And this is a picture from 1954. We were still working. Every year we would get together, and if you see the little box in the lower right corner, our club made these, and I think other clubs did as well with us, and filled them with candy and toys and things and sent them into orphanages in Chicago for the children or hospitals to give kids a treat at Christmas. And they would make hundreds of these boxes, and they were made from postcards. If you can look closely, you see pictures of uh, key buildings, and they had a pattern which we still have. We made a bunch of them, didn't we, Kirsten and Donna? We made a bunch of them for our 150th, and I think many of us have one. So they had a lot of fun, and everybody would bring a dish. They would spend the day making the little boxes and have a luncheon and just share time together. So we continued then we had an organization called the Interclub, which was just evolved from all the garden clubs in Elgin that had been established probably in like the 40s and 50s. We had 5 garden clubs, plus we had the Men's Garden Club and some other organizations that were centered around gardening. So our organizations every year would have a garden party show at Coleman School. And again, it would raise money for different charities in town. In the 1950s, so for those of us who were around then, the 50s, everybody was so glad that World War II was over and men were coming home and people were starting to establish homes and new homes were being built, and everybody was kind of nesting, and women really got into taking care of beautifying their homes and enjoying some culture again. So one of the things that became very popular was flower arranging. And flower arranging became a really serious competitive event. And these 2 little cartoons were in our minutes, which I thought were so cute, just kind of portraying women of the day kind of being a little bit catty with one another about their flower arranging. But the competitions were very fierce and very serious, and you had to be a certified judge. And we had a couple of certified judges from our club, but they had to go through training, and they would come to our club meetings and kind of coach our members on the best way to do their flower arranging so they could win prizes. So in the 50s, we also kind of became environmental activists a little bit. We joined with other organizations to install copper nameplates on the trees at Trout Park. We joined Isaac Walton, Sportsman, a bunch of different clubs to try to preserve Trout Park. And we tried very hard to prevent the tollway. Collectively, all these organizations worked really hard to prevent the tollway from going through and destroying a third of Trout Park. Unfortunately, we lost, and they did destroy a big part of it. But in 1972, at least, finally, it was designated an Illinois nature preserve. So some of our work did not get lost in our efforts. This was just a group shot from 1957. We've always had about 40 members. That's about the size of our club. And many faces you may know in there that are still with us. Our big event, our big project in the 60s, and again, we worked with all the other garden clubs to do this, was to raise money and install a fountain at Fountain Square. 1960s was the whole movement for redeveloping the downtown and our city hall, and Hemmons was built, all of that renovation. So our clubs collectively worked. We did everything from bake sales to selling newspaper subscriptions, but we raised the $20,000, and in October of 1967, we made the Tribune newspaper with the big headline that we opened our fountain at Fountain Square. It was all part of the urban renewal projects. And then again, all of our clubs, not just the Elgin Garden Club, but all the clubs that existed were really committed to beautifying the downtown. So we all kind of adopted different areas of downtown to work on. We had a committee, there was a committee set up by the city. Phyllis Blizzard, who was in our club, was the chairman of that committee, but that was the committee that coordinated, decided what should be planted where, and all the volunteers, the clubs bought the flowers and did the work. So we kind of fast forward to the building I'm in today, the Elgin History Museum. In 1997, we've always had a close association with this building and with the museum, but in 1997, we made the commitment to take care of the gardens in front of the building. And we did a lot of heavy lifting in 1997 and 1998 to establish these gardens. Our garden club members have worked really hard and take turns coming almost every week to deadhead and to maintain. And we expanded then to the west side of the sidewalk with the second garden bed a few years later. So we've always enjoyed doing this, and it's near and dear to our heart. Then in the early 2000s, we took on Hawthorn Hill, so an area of Hawthorn Hill, to try to renovate and get rid of the non-native species. And so we go out there and work every year to plant natives and get rid of the non-natives. And we even have a tree planted out there for one of our members who passed away a few years ago. Many of our members went to the Girl Scout camp that was on the side of Hawthorn Hill, so we had a particular interest. So then 2 years ago, we got a grant from the National Garden Association to put in a pollinator garden at Hawthorn Hill. They were trying to beautify the front of the building, and this area was just kind of, they had made a half-hearted attempt at doing something there. And so we took that on with our grant money and have established a pollinator garden. This will be the second year of it. And we put in 233 volunteer hours. We planted 300 plants, 22 different species. So this year, please drive out and take a look in a few more weeks. It should be absolutely stunning. I can't do this presentation without mentioning one of our, I wouldn't say one of our dearest member, I think our longest term member we ever had, Ginny Umberger, which many of you probably knew Ginny. Ginny joined our club in 1953, and she was a teacher and a mentor and an advocate and probably one of the first naturalists in town. Her and her husband were also started the Gourd, I think they started or were charter members of the Gourd Society, and they had hundreds and hundreds of gourds, beautiful gourds that they had collected. She's featured in a book called Grace from the Garden by Deborah Landwehr Engel. There's a chapter dedicated to her, and it's beautifully written. It really describes her well. So the Elgin Garden Club is not the only club in town, and I think Jenny would be proud to see what's going on today, because besides our garden club and some other garden clubs, there has been a huge movement over the last 5 years, 10 years, probably 5 years, a huge movement to encourage more community gardening, whether it's vegetable gardens or butterfly gardens or natural areas. There's been a huge movement, and there's an organization that was started a few years ago called the Elgin Community Garden Network. And it is what it says. It's a network of gardeners, people that want to have little community gardens. They could be at a church, at a school, on private land. It doesn't really matter. It's just people who want to grow vegetables, and in many cases, give them back to our food pantries and places like that. So we have over 25 throughout the city that we know of. There's probably some others that are not part of this Elgin Community Garden Network. But I thought we'd just talk about a couple of the bigger ones, the more significant ones that we know a little bit more about. Sherman Hospital, some of the employees there several years ago, I think Sherman was a leader in the link between, health. Being a hospital isn't just to come to when you're sick. How do we do some preventive medicine? And that includes eating healthy and exercise. And so they kind of use this as an example to encourage both employees and their patients to to eat healthier and take care of their bodies. So they started this community garden, and it is now run by the University of Illinois Master Gardeners in partnership with the hospital. And they offer garden plots for individuals and employees. The Master Gardeners provide classes and guidance for people who are still learning a little bit about gardening. And then the Master Naturalists also are stewards of 110 acres of prairie area out there at Sherman. And their volunteers harvest and process native seeds. They also have beehives out there so they can get their own honey, and it's just a phenomenal area. Even the men's shed has been gotten in on the game and been building some things for them. And I think they're going to look at building compost bins for them this year. So it is truly a community garden. The whole community's kind of involved in making it work. And then if somebody's online that knows more about what's going on with the East Side Neighborhood Garden, I encourage you to speak up, because I don't know a lot about it, but I do know this is in the Gifford Park area, and it's on the site of the old Channing Y. And I was still working for the city when this was supposed to be getting developed into houses. So all the streets were put in, and the water and everything all the infrastructure was put in. And then 2007 hit and the houses never got built. So I assume Gifford Park Association took the initiative to ask the city if they could do community gardens there. And so I think this is, I don't know, the third or fourth year of it. I think it started in 2008. And it's a perfect, it's a perfect example of putting land that's just sitting there doing no good to anybody to a wonderful use. And it's, besides growing food, it's also a great gathering place for the neighborhood, and a place for people to congregate and share. So is anybody on here? Trish, did you want to say something about it? Or anybody from Gifford Park on our call?
Yeah, I can say something about it. It was, you're right, Gifford Park started the initiative, mainly led by Laura. Oh gosh.
Nor, right?
Oh, thank you. I know her by her maiden name, and I still have trouble with them with the married name. Anyway, we're now up to 40, I think it's 45 plots.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, so all of these that we're showing you, they all have Facebook pages. So if you're interested in getting involved or learning more about them too, you can always find them on Facebook. And then this is not so much a site as it is an organization. The Northern Kane County Wild Ones is a wonderful organization. Our Northern Kane County, Illinois chapter was founded in 2009. Many of our Elgin Garden Club members are also members of the Northern Kane County Wild Ones. It's a not-for-profit that encourages native planting. They provide environmental education and advocate for saving lands and saving native species. And they're committed to promoting the use of native plants. They have a phenomenal plant sale every spring. Usually, I think they always hold it at Hawthorn Hill. I don't know what they're doing virtually this year, but I understand they are having the sale, so that's good. So you can always get your native plants through them. And then this is not a eating vegetable garden, but it's a phenomenal resource for butterflies to come to our neighborhood. It's the NENA Butterfly Garden. NENA stands for the Northeast Neighborhood Association. This was a vacant lot at the corner of Ann and Douglas. At one time, a church owned it, and it was just sitting there. They never used it. So eventually the city bought it. And then the Northeast neighborhood, it was just sitting there empty, and some kids might play soccer on it once in a while. So NENA decided it would make a great site for a butterfly garden and a little pocket garden, because that neighborhood is very densely populated at that end of Douglas. And it just gave a nice place for people to go and sit and enjoy the butterflies and the flowers. So volunteers, not just from the neighborhood, but volunteers from Wild Ones and all kinds of places go there and volunteer they're there almost every Saturday. And they have established a phenomenal garden that they have signage that teaches about all the different types of butterflies. They hold events there for school children and for neighborhood kids. So it's just a really nice addition to the community. And when things start blooming, I encourage you all just to, go with for an afternoon and stroll through here and enjoy all the beautiful flowers. So as Trish kind of plugged at the beginning of this is a picture of the book. We need to change it now to 106 years of growing, but they do have the book. There's a whole lot more information in that book, especially just about the history of women and women in Elgin and Elgin, how some of these women and their families are associated in Elgin. So it's an interesting read, whether you're a gardener or not, and just a little piece of history. So if you're interested, you let the museum know that you would like to reserve one. They're going to be getting a new shipment in soon. So does anybody have any questions that I can try to answer? Whoops. I think we have to take people off of mute.
I think everyone should be able to unmute themselves if they want to talk. Barb Evans just pointed out that the Elgin Community Garden was established in 2018. It's our third year.
All righty. Any other questions or comments? Kirsten, did you have anything to add that I missed?
No, I feel like there's so much information in there. I always thought that there was one story about one of the ladies in the early years that she had meeting at her house, and actually she had a wooden plot that she made a fire and served coffee down there. And I always thought that was so amazing when I think about the big dresses and that they wore and so on. So that was one that sort of intrigued me in the book.
Well, and that was the mansion, and I know my streets on Highland. There's now an apartment building next to it. It's the Big Blue, what is their names that live there? He's a plumber. Oh gosh, it's on the south side of the street. That big mansion is. Pardon me?
Chapman?
Yes,
Chapman, Sherman?
yes, Chapman's house. That was Mrs. Bosworth. And they owned all that land, that everything, like, for 2 or 3 blocks. And she's the one that we'd have a garden meeting every May at her house. And she'd go down to the woods, and we'd walk through all the fields of Scilla, which you still see a lot of that along Highland Avenue. Yeah, that was Mrs. Bosworth.
That was amazing.
Yeah. It was something. Well, if there's no other questions, I guess.
Great presentation, Cherie. Thank you again. It's always interesting to learn about the history of gardening in Elgin.
Thank you. I'll turn it back over to Trish.
Cherie, do you want to talk again about the event you have in November? I don't know if everyone was on the call when you spoke about that.
Yeah, this doesn't have anything to do with gardening, but I wrote a play along with Sylvia Grady, who many of you probably know, called Aging with Grace and Humor. And it's about getting older and what we go through, and mostly in a humorous way, a lighthearted way. And it's a reading. And we're going to we had planned on doing it a year ago, but then of course COVID prevented any kind of performances. So we were going to do it at Imago. And so in the meantime, we were just getting geared back up to set a new date, and then Imago collapsed in the snow. So we were getting a little nervous, but we are going to be holding the play in November at the Discovery Church. And the proceeds from the play go to the senior services. So we have a really fun cast of Karen Fox, Mark Siegel, Bev Hoffman, Sylvia, myself, and Richard Paul. So it's a reading. So there's 6 of us reading different, it's little vignettes. And we are hoping that people will buy tickets when the time comes, or reserve tickets and pay at the door. And it's all for a good cause. And we're really looking forward to doing that in November. I think it's the first week in November, but there'll be a lot on Facebook and out in the public about it.
Mhm. Excellent. Does anyone else have any questions or comments?
It was a great presentation. Thank you, Cherie.
Well, thank you. Thank everybody for being here.
Thank you,
Okay,
Cherie.
everyone.
Beautiful job.
All right. We'll see you all soon.
Go out and dig in the dirt. It's perfect
Yeah,
time to get your seeds
absolutely.
in the garden. Thank
Okay.
you, everyone.
Thank you.